So, Resident Evil 7 turned out to be a much more contentious game than I was expecting. After giving it another playthrough, my first in about 2 years, I have to admit that nowadays, my feelings on it are pretty torn, more so than any other entry in the series. I want to praise the game for revitalizing that classic gameplay formula, as well as a new twist that it adds, but can't help but feel as if the execution of these ideas felt kinda barren in the end. I want to concur with the common consensus of this being the scariest entry, but I also gotta point out the multiple horror cliches souring the experience. It's a little weird, to be honest. Like, anytime I feel like this game evolves a franchise in a satisfying way, it takes a bit of a shimmy backwards. I'm not trying to sit here and say it's a bad game per se. Hell, I actually think it's a solid title overall. But the areas for improvement are, frankly, pretty obvious. I will say this though, playing this game as a lifelong Resident Evil fan, back in 2017, it had to have felt like you just reached Nirvana. After years of mediocre action games that were Resident Evil in name only, after so many stupid movies that were also Resident Evil in name only, finally things were looking up. Finally, a proper Resident Evil experience in the modern age, an actual survival horror this time no less. I wasn't a fan myself at the time, but even then, I was well aware of the buzz surrounding this game. I remember my old high school doing a segment on their little morning news block where they would discuss some upcoming releases, and this thing received quite the press. This shit was a big deal. And after going through this franchise for myself a couple years back, I can't imagine my initial feelings being any different than what most Resident Evil fans had felt 8 years ago. Unimaginable levels of we're so fucking back. God, I hope Requiem is of a similar nature, because if it's not, there are some options for me on the table, let's put it that way. Like I said earlier, those sentiments of mine are a little different here in 2025, almost 2026. Fuck, time is going so fast. But none of the issues I spend the duration of this video addressing will ever take away from that sigh of relief I had felt when I first got my hands on this game. It's miles from perfection, but man, coming off of 5 and 6, it sure felt like a goddamn masterpiece. Like diving into the grease traps at McDonald's, then heading to get some gourmet lobster tails from the place across the street. And despite the attempt to bring the series back to its roots, Resident Evil 7 still offered a ton of room for Capcom to bring in some fresh new ideas to the series. In an effort to rekindle that old lost flame of the original trilogy, it also makes an effort to push the series forward through its myriad of different influences. This includes atmosphere and story-related stuff that I'll get into way later, but in terms of gameplay, there's DNA from a whole disparate list of sources as well, which I will also cover in due time. But let's kick this shit off with the first thing people naturally point to in a review of this game. For a game aiming to put the horror in survival horror, you'll need the proper perspective to pull it off. A perspective that'll really immerse a player in the horrifying world the game seeks to create. In the past, Resident Evil would accomplish this through its fixed camera system. Entering a different room, moving across a hallway, or merely turning around a corner would shift the player's perspective. It was genius, not only because of the superb cinematography, but more so in the way it capitalizes on the idea that true fear lies in the things you cannot immediately see, and that danger could, quite literally in some cases, be right around the corner. Keeping anything dangerous obscured until it's right in front of you really gets goosebumps rising unlike anything else. I've had to have played RE1 Remake at least 5 times as of writing this, and I still get spooked more often than I'm willing to admit. But the unfortunate truth is that these games were 15 to 20 years old, and newcomers would have likely been put off by this weird and obtuse perspective. So in order to retain that element of hidden terror, or the perspective most are well attuned to, Resident Evil 7 opted to set the entire game in first person. Now, I obviously prefer the approach those classic titles took, as someone who goes apeshit over the cinematic qualities of games. But much like any other big change to a big franchise, I was willing to at least give it a shot. After all, a change like this isn't exactly brand new, and if it worked for a series like Metroid, it could work for Resident Evil as well. And in a lot of different areas, This new perspective does, indeed, work in providing that same horror experience many had longed for. Now, the obvious thing to point out here is that because you are now directly in the character's shoes, it's no wonder that the game's going to make you squirm and quiver. You're no longer spectating these scenarios, you're actively a part of it now. However, I feel it's important to really stress the surrounding game design and how well it complements this new first-person perspective. The level design has this incredibly claustrophobic feel to it that confines players to what is directly in front of them and only what is directly in front of them. This element of rummaging through cabinets and garbage bins in a desperate search for munitions to keep myself alive was always one of my favorite staples of the survival horror trilogy, and that element is not only retained in 7, but takes on an entirely new dynamic thanks to its first-person view. Now that we see and feel everything Ethan does, that struggle to stay alive feels all the more personal. When he's low on health and out of the mystical healing juice, the red Vignet, those sluggish movements and those strained moans and groans, all those techniques video games use to tell the player, hey man, you're gonna fucking die, man. It all feels so real now. But I know what you're probably all thinking. Well, duh, this is all pretty basic stuff. And you'd be correct. So why don't I point out something that's a bit more exciting to discuss? And to do that, I must first harken back to what I said earlier regarding the compositional techniques of that beloved trilogy, and their ability to obscure enemies in order to build tension. Resident Evil 7 is able to accomplish this as well, albeit with techniques capable only with a first-person view. Resident Evil 7's mold monsters aren't anything like the zombies we've come to recognize this series for. They hit hard and take a good amount of ammunition to kill, so there will be plenty of instances where you'll feel inclined to avoid fighting and therefore have no choice but to run. And the first-person perspective helps to stress the importance of actually listening to your pursuers, as this claustrophobic viewpoint renders them practically invisible. You can't see how close they are, nor can you simply flick the camera around to get a peek. All you have to work with in your pursuit of safety are the pitter-patters and the snarls of the goopy asbestos beasts lumbering towards you. Again, you have only what is directly in eyeshot. The act of turning around, even for a second, is taking a massive risk. And I gotta tell you, this made certain segments of the game pretty hair-raising. I would like to shout out that Child's Room section in particular for nearly giving me cardiac arrest. But wait a minute, I'm over here discussing stalking, and yet I've only made a mention of the molded freaks. Don't I recognize that there's an even bigger piece of this aspect of the game? Oh yeah, trust me, I'll get to this fucker in a moment. But as I was saying, this newfound perspective provided a pretty interesting twist on an element that's been here since the very beginning. Instead of confining everything to static angles to keep players on their toes, Resident Evil 7 confines everything to narrow hallways to induce and maintain short bursts of panic. It's the same philosophy achieved in 2 different ways, and that's pretty cool. Would you like to know what isn't cool? Actually participating in the game's quote-unquote combat. So being in first person helped Resident Evil 7 a whole lot when it comes to being a survival horror. But when it comes to actually fighting the damned things, this is where the cracks start beginning to form. And what's funny is that a lot of these issues wouldn't have been nearly as significant had the game not fallen under the old, tired cliche of becoming more action-focused towards the end. Simply put, the first-person perspective, better yet, the way it's implemented here, isn't well suited for traditional action scenarios. Movement is generally pretty cumbersome, with the added bonus of having some quite lengthy animations for healing and such. Which is, of course, fine when you're dealing with a small number of enemies and you have several opportunities to find an escape route. But it is not fine when the game forces you down numerous choke points where dispatching them becomes something of a chore. A lot of the people condemn the ship segment for this reason, and their complaints are valid. But personally, I think that the tunnel leading back to the Baker household is more deserving of ire. This is when the game really decides to just throw as many enemies at you as possible. And quite frankly, I just find it to be pretty damn boring. It isn't exactly what I consider difficult, but it's pretty obvious that the design choice doesn't accommodate a more run-and-gun shooter McGavin playstyle. I delve into this issue a bit more, but In due time, my friends. In due time. In an attempt to move on from the heavily divisive action gameplay of 6, 7 opted to bring Resident Evil back to basics, to its roots, to the very foundation of the franchise. We'd see the long-awaited return of those core design principles that helped shape the iconic PS1 trilogy. Things like backtracking through sprawling vacant areas to retrieve key items you'd use later on. Things like scarcely placed resources with the added emphasis on preserving them throughout long periods of time. Things like interacting with pieces within a setting's interior to solve puzzles. You get the whole picture, I presume. You played these fucking games before. But a straight emulation of those classic games and their principles would feel largely unsatisfactory. We want Resident Evil to stay true to those principles it was founded upon, sure, but we also want to see the series move forward in interesting and commendable ways. Capcom achieved this feat in one way with the new first-person perspective, but we've gone into detail regarding that already. So now let's take a look at the other big shift this title introduced that would also go on to become a series staple since then. The Resident Evil franchise has become known to throw a little wrench into a familiar gameplay loop here and now. Most famously, the introduction of Crimson Heads in the RE1 remake, a change so minute on the surface, but in execution, utterly recontextualizes any knowledge you might have had with its original counterpart. 7 takes a pretty similar approach in reshaping the classic survival horror formula with its stalker enemies. Jack and Margaret Baker act as an oppressive force that's constantly hunting you down throughout their respective areas, and I think that, conceptually, this addition is so perfect for a franchise like Resident Evil. This series, renowned for instilling feelings of dread and vulnerability, is screaming for an enemy type that's in a constant state of pursuit toward the player. And in terms of accommodating that OG-style Resident Evil gameplay, a stalker enemy could achieve precisely that. There now lies an even greater emphasis on resource management and knowledge of the map layouts along with the contents of certain rooms, now that a potential game over could be just a few steps away. It adds an extra layer of urgency to a gameplay loop already lauded for its ability to make even the toughest of players feel panicked and afraid and small. It is a brilliant idea to say the least, and the funny thing is that this isn't even unfamiliar territory with Capcom either. They've done this shit before, like a Haunted Ground, anyone? That game is fucking gas, and it's pretty obvious, to me at least, that RE7 borrowed a few of its design ideas from Haunted Ground. Opening and closing doors being a legitimate strategic decision, the personalities of the stalkers bleeding into the pursuit methods and means of interacting with the player, it's perfect. The ideas are on the table, things are looking pretty great, the potential is fucking insurmountable. So how is it in execution? Ahem. I'll cut to the chase here. The stalker AI is stagnant if I were to describe them in a single word. They just shift around in a clumsy stupor, where manipulating them in order to swing past becomes too much of a cakewalk. Utilizing your familiarity with the surrounding areas to find hiding spots becomes redundant when avoiding the bakers as this mind-numbingly easy. I hate to put down something in this manner, but that's just how it feels, man. It's so bad that, I swear to God, the only instances where they actually found me were during scripted events. Hell yeah. Hell, Marjorie doesn't even spot me at all. Not even once. These areas aren't even that large. Like, what the fuck, man? Put some damn effort in. I get that this is their first attempt at doing something like this. You know, you don't just design an enemy like Mr. X overnight. I just feel like, with the way in which the AI functions, nearly everything I said prior just simply cannot be applied here. And that sucks ass, man. Don't even get me started on the fact that this whole concept is dropped once it's time to confront my boy Lucas, where the game immediately switches to a linear hallway simulator with puzzles so stupidly simple it genuinely feels insulting. Like, I'm supposed to turn the paintings on this side of the wall so they match that side of the wall? What a fucking brain teaser, that one. Golly gee whizzers, you sure as shit got me on that one, chief. Okay, so the stalker enemies were a botched opportunity, fine. Whatever. What about the basic gameplay loop, though? The act of navigating areas for keys, managing items, and all that shit. How do those elements fare here exactly? Well, there's certainly some good elements here, but for the most part, this shit feels pretty cut and dry. I'll give them this though. I'm a big fan of the way the molded respawns in a way that essentially punishes unnecessary backtracking. And given the biology of these monsters, there's a perfect in-universe reason for them to respawn in the first place. It's just the exploration, puzzle, and resource management elements that feel significantly shallow, even disregarding the fact that they were already doing this shit much better back when the New York Jets were still a relevant franchise. Similarly to the Stalkers, this gameplay loop feels pretty bare bones for the most part, and it winds up streamlining certain aspects of the originals and not in ways I feel are particularly good. One thing I cherished a lot in the first two Resident Evils was a set of keys you would obtain, which would only unlock doors with the corresponding symbols. I like this a lot because a game never states which type of door it is until you actually interact with it. It not only has this element of mystery, but it also means that they take on the form of a resource no different than any health item or weapon you currently possess. Should I bring along every key I currently have? I don't know, man. However, with the way 7 handles this sort of thing, it severely dilutes the entire process of decision making. Only one key is required at a time, and which doors they unlock is literally spelled out for you. And by the way, there aren't a whole lot of doors that require these types of keys either. So there's one aspect of itemizing made completely fucking boring in this instance, but what about everything else? Listen, I cannot be the only one who has a serious bone to pick with the game's crafting mechanic, and the franchise's further insistence on using it in every single goddamn game since then. I will say it works fine in something like Resident Evil Village or RE4 Remake, because those games are comparatively action-focused. But for a game advertising itself as a return to the classic survival horror gameplay, this decision feels counterintuitive. Not like it's bad on paper, the RE2 remake would later expand upon this idea, but the game is already crazy generous with the resources you find, so implementing a system designed to give players not only more of it, but more powerful variants of it, feels like overkill. I don't know, maybe all this whining I'm doing just means I should play on Madhouse difficulty. And perhaps that's what all of you are thinking. Snakes, of course the AI is going to act dumb. Of course he's going to stock up on resources so easily. You're only playing on normal difficulty. I don't know, man. A well-balanced level of difficulty that's punishing but still fair shouldn't be locked behind higher difficulties. Nearly every game I've played, Resident Evil or otherwise, did a fine enough job in encouraging me to learn its systems without feeling handholdy or punishing me for the slightest mistakes on a normal difficulty level. This is the entire purpose of a normal difficulty option after all. Shit, I don't even want to know what the game's easy mode is like if normal is like this. All that aside, I feel like Resident Evil 7 is an overall step down gameplay-wise. It has some strong ideas, and I can certainly commend the effort to take those classic titles and polish them up for the modern age, but again, it all feels so streamlined and devoid of friction and encouraging the player to actually make decisions. I hardly ever felt as I needed to make any drastic decisions involving inventory, nor did wasting away any molded feel like I was putting myself at a disadvantage moving forward. It's such an oversimplification of what the original trilogy had accomplished in the 90s, and in the end, I just felt kind of empty once it was over. And again, this is all completely ignoring just how hard this game pivots into linear action later on. It's not like any of this is horrible or anything. It's a fine pick up and play sort of deal if you're just looking to immerse yourself in some nice atmosphere and even nicer culmination of various horror icons. And speaking of which, Resident Evil 7 mostly dropped the ball in blending elements old and new for its gameplay. But when it comes to blending different ideas for the purposes of atmosphere, story, and general presentation, this game went all in. I like to think Resident Evil as a celebration of Western horror, and if you take a look back to its inception, this distinction becomes obvious. After all, traces of George Romero's classic trilogy of zombie films can be found all over the first two titles in particular, especially the second, where the man himself literally directed the damn trailer. But it was 7 where Capcom took this Western horror influence and expanded upon it even further than before or since. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the obvious frame of reference here, But there's elements of Evil Dead, The Thing, Blair Witch Project, etc. The prestige of American horror is vast, and Resident Evil 7 saw Capcom utilizing the ethos of these properties to forge something that feels like an ultimate celebration of the genre as a whole. Whether it's directly referencing the dinner table sequence from Chainsaw Massacre, or emulating the morbid and absurd humor of Evil Dead, Resident Evil 7, while certainly on the nose at times, pays homages to the classics of the genre, but it never once felt as if it felt like an insincere imitation of those films, nor did I feel as if it felt disconnected with the ethos of the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil has always been about fusing elements of zombies, psychological horror, and black comedy, all of which are accounted for here, and furthermore, rural Louisiana is a perfect setting for a classic Resident Evil story that has these elements and these influences. The sticky, sweaty, swampy atmosphere of that setting allows for some particularly nasty visuals, and the game wastes no time indulging in the opportunity. The moldy, dilapidated interiors, the sickly, almost melting look of the bakers, the sheer amount of food, I think that's food. I don't know, man. We better call up RFK Jr. just to make sure, man. He'll probably take a bite. The bakers themselves feel an awful lot like that family from the aforementioned Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and while the scene they've referenced here isn't as effective as the one in the movie, they still do a pretty good job in capturing the same tone, along with the added bonus of establishing the characters you'll soon be going up against. Jack himself feels like the writers had taken a page out of Evil Dead 2's screenplay. We even have a groovy reference here. Awesome. His banter with Ethan is pretty frightening, sure, but it's his bleak sense of humor that really gets me to sing his praises. The man just has an absurd concept of violence, where he'll often take full advantage of any given scenario to enact a particular brand of carnage. Your first encounter with him in the garage is filled to the brim with shit like this, and depending on the way you engage him here, you could get something entirely different each time you play. I always make sure to use the car method, as this moment where he rams himself into a piston just amuses the hell out of me. And while I did have some harsh words to say regarding his AI, Jack still managed to pull out the most effective jump scare in the entire game, possibly the entire series. I don't even need to mention it, you already know. Resident Evil 7 borrows a variety of ideas from a variety of different horror films to full effect, crafting a horror experience meant to celebrate the genre's past while still having its own identity overall. The tape-related content courtesy of the Blair Witch influence is a bit on the weaker side though. The cameraman segment early in the game is kinda brilliant. It feels like an idea for a full-fledged horror game that's just waiting to happen and just needs a proper developer and team to just bring it to life. I would play that shit day fucking one. But aside from that though, this element of the game was mainly relegated to providing the player with clues for upcoming scenarios, such as displaying optimal escape routes in the old house. I don't really like it, and I winded up just ditching the aspect of the game altogether for this playthrough. I feel like they could have done something a little more interesting, and it kinda just feels like another wasted opportunity. But by now, I've already discussed things such as setting, presentation, and characters, so I guess the next obvious step for this video to take would be narrative analysis. This is something I usually do on this channel, but I think we're going to take a pass this time. Not because I find the story to be so painfully uninteresting that it's just not worth talking about, it's just that there's one thing about the story that was so agonizing in its execution that it put me off of the story of Resident Evil 7 almost entirely.
You're pitiful, you're pitiful, you're pitiful, it's true. Never had a date that you couldn't inflate, and you smell repulsive too. What a bummer being you.
Forget about the movies, forget about Resident Evil 6 as a whole, forget about all those weird niche games nobody even wants to talk about anymore. Forget about the fact that Capcom straight up disrespects the original trilogy and had to rely on GOG, for people to just fucking play them legally. They can't even be bothered to fucking port the games. Fuck you and the things they said about and fuck. No, but just forget all about that. The worst thing to ever happen to this franchise is none other than Mr. Fuckboy Ethan Winters himself. Guy looks like he gets genuinely peeved when asked for ID at a grocery store. He seems like the type of dude who'd wear a Yankees cap and not be able to name a single player from any era. He has a type of energy that screams, I don't listen to metal, but man, those sleep token guys can really write a jammy jam. When taking group photos, he makes damn sure to get a silly one. He probably goes to church on Wednesdays. He has a complexion of a pair of Fruit of the Loom socks. He has about as much emotional depth as ChatGPT. He looks like he watches Burn Notice, drinks Nestle brand water, and smells like a fistful of Little Tree's car fresheners. I don't like this guy. Fuck. It's so weird how this game would even bother trying to make a cohesive character when the intention was to clearly make Ethan a self-insert for the player. It's such a drastic contradiction, and it really pulled me away from the experience on several occasions. Like, here you have this character with a missing wife and a death-defying mission to track her down, and naturally, you'd leave clues that hint at what might have happened to said wife. And in the midst of discovering these hints, Capcom saw it fit to give Ethan a modest reaction because, you know, self-insert, am I right? This is a verbose way of saying that Ethan's reaction here and reactions to a lot of things are kind of fucking dull. Ethan isn't reacting in a way that fit witnessing that the hellhole he just walked into is indeed a hellhole his wife has been trapped in, mind you, but rather the type of reaction someone would have from spilling their drink. Why bother writing a character with an established backstory and an explicit motivation, but have him behave like your average player character, basically almost like fucking Link or Samus? It reaches a breaking point when it comes to deciding who gets the last antidote. Like, they fucking give you the bad ending for giving it to Zoe. Like, they make you guilty for choosing... Fuck off, dude, you piece of shit. Fuck you. But enough about that. What about the actual character himself? He's a complete tool, to put it nicely. We've gone over how emotionally vapid he is, but on the rare occasion where he does raise his voice somewhat, shit gets comical. His interaction with the cop is infamous and for good reason. Like, my man, you gotta be at least 30. At the very least 30. So why the fuck are you asking for the cops' gun? I don't even think a 12-year-old would be dumb enough to make such a request. A 4-year-old wouldn't. My cats wouldn't. Ethan Winters is very much a result of being unable to come to an actual decision with their main protagonist. He teeters constantly between feeling like a player character and an established character, and obviously, you can't have both. This is what happens when you try to do two things that are fundamentally at odds with each other, and it gets even worse with Village when his stupidity is ramped up tenfold. Fuck Ethan Winters. I hate this motherfucker. I hope he's not in Requiem. I hope that motherfucker stays dead. Fuck you, bitch. Time to wrap this shit up with a topic I've been most eager to address in this video. Whether or not this entry truly is the scariest of them all. If you've hung around the Resident Evil fandom, highly recommend not doing that, or just gaming circles in general, the question of, out of all the Resident Evil games, which one do you think is the scariest? The answers would most likely be the RE1 or 2 remakes, or 7. Resident Evil 7 has a distinction of being regarded as a franchise's pinnacle of terror and fright, and the feeling of pissing yourself. But just how true do I personally find that sentiment to be? Well, honestly, it's mostly true, I guess? Yeah, it's weird. Much like a lot of the other things this game does, there are plenty of instances where I could just nod my head and go, yeah, I can dig it, I can see where you're coming from. But there are plenty of moments where I felt the complete opposite. And in the case of producing scares, Resident Evil 7 sees perhaps its biggest mixed bag of all for me, personally. I've gone over and hinted at certain aspects and even particular moments throughout the game that gave me the creepers. The child's room section again is damn brilliant. It's another case, arguably the best case, of the game using the first person perspective to its advantage, where the entire room's pitch fucking black, And if it isn't covered by your flashlight, you ain't gonna make out anything in that damned room. You're slowly trekking through it, when all of a sudden the roars of like a dozen molded echo throughout the room, and your ass is left with nothing to do but to run. I've also hinted at the element of psychological horror that this game employs. It does so in two ways, one of which is pretty obvious and it ties back into gameplay scenarios like the one I just mentioned, but the other way involves the bakers. Later on towards the end of the game, Ethan has what I believe is a vision of Jack pleading to him to put a stop to Evelyn. It's a nice twist that puts so much shit into perspective. Jack's antics, most notably the moments in which he inflicts pain upon himself, become something of a tragedy now that the player is made aware of the suffering the bakers were experiencing, and that Jack wasn't a deranged lunatic, but rather a person who just wanted to put an end to their misery, which, to me, is the most effective breed of horror. Lucas Baker, on the other hand, serves as an interesting subversion or foil to Jack. He sees Evelyn's gift as precisely that, a gift, and the act of cleansing him of this perceived gift would be robbing him of the one thing that gives him an identity, some sort of purpose in life. It gets even more tragic too. A thing I've really come to appreciate with this series is its remarkable sense of visual storytelling. Reading various notes left behind by researchers, watching as it becomes progressively detached from any sort of logic. Looking at the walls and seeing how dilapidated everything has become, and seeing that at one point these were just regular locations, but have just got a whole zombie infestation just running right through that bitch. That element is also present here, and the whole family drama angle puts a seriously tragic spin on everything. Inspecting Lucas's room and seeing what an accomplished kid he was, rummaging through old photographs and mementos, these are really striking ways of letting the player know that this is a real family who had their worlds turned upside down in an instant. It's, dare I say, some of the most effective psychological horror this series has ever seen. But unfortunately, not everything can be so perfect with Resident Evil 7. No matter how much I praise it, there will always be a massive asterisk attached to each and every bit of praise I hand it. The asterisk here is that the person responsible for the Baker's demise is one of the most tired cliches in horror history. Seriously, the whole creepy little girl trope had already been done to death before. And it's not like there's anything subversive or interesting here with the way it's handled. I mean, yeah, her character ties into the family drama at the center of the game's narrative, but her demeanor and the way she's utilized to scare the player are so tacky and predictable. Lots of giggles, lots of sing-songy shit. You have seen literally everything this character has to offer before. Another point of emphasis is the dialogue. Yeah, some of the writing in this game is just... yeesh, it's not very good. Talk about excessive profanity that borders on comedy. And not the black comedy that's actually cool and memorable for the right reasons. I'm talking shit that's actually eye-roll inducing. This line right here had me giggling like a shithead even the first time I heard it. It's like, dude, are you trying to be intimidating or are you trying to make me laugh? The worst part about all this is the jump scares. There are a lot of them. Some of them are quite effective and actually play with your expectations a bit. Meanwhile, a vast majority of them feel pretty forced and pretty transparent. Like, there were plenty of times where I was moving along with whatever it was I was doing, looked onward and said to myself, yep, there's a jump scare over there. I'm not one of those weird horror nerds who's all hung up on the mere concept of a jump scare, but much like anything else, there's a proper way of implementing them, and that rarely shows up here. But in spite of all that, if you were to sit here and tell me that Resident Evil 7 is currently the most frightening entry in the series, I'd have no trouble believing that. It's a game that plays with the strengths of its influences, rather than wearing them on their sleeves, and some of the storytelling can be dramatic in a rather terrifying way. And let's face it here, the Molded has got to be the creepiest enemy type in the series. Watching people turn into zombies is frightening in numerous ways, sure, but at least you can immediately tell what they were. With the Molded, you're only given mere hints until you actually discover their true nature later on. And it makes them even more terrifying. But more to the point I was just making, Resident Evil 7 will provide no shortage of scary moments you're likely to remember for years. But simultaneously, it is filled with so many old tropes that it just waters down the tension. Resident Evil 7 is often heralded as the series' big return to form, a huge leap forward out of the hole the series spent the past decade burying themselves in. And people aren't making such claims without reason. There is legitimately plenty to enjoy with Resident Evil 7. But therein lies the main issue I have with this game. It is merely enjoyable. For an entry hoping to reinterpret what the classics offered, they definitely could have fleshed a few things out more. Bold ideas are nothing without the execution that they demand, and Resident Evil 7 is a case where it just takes too many missteps with its ideas, forcing it to fall short of being that game I very much know it could have been. And for a game whose primary goal was to steer things back in the right direction, I would have liked to have been a bit more modest in my analysis. Usually when something exists to sort of roll out the red carpet for future entries to expand upon its ideas and concepts, I tend to be a bit more lenient. However, in the very unfortunate case of Resident Evil 7, the reason I was so harsh is because I'm not sure if we're ever going to get a true survival horror like the classics ever again, and that has turned me into a spiteful and vindictive prick. So join me next time as I discuss a game that trampled on literally everything this game worked so hard to establish. It's gonna be a tough video to make, to say the least.